In the vast expanse of the galaxy, the mighty Xus Empire, known for its technological supremacy and ruthless military tactics, faces an unexpected foe: humanity. What started as a war over resources quickly escalates into a struggle for survival as the humans reveal a shocking technological breakthrough: weaponized FTL drives that generate micro-black holes, obliterating entire fleets in an instant. As the Xus flagship is torn apart and their forces crumble, the Empire's belief in its invincibility shatters. With humanity's resilience and innovation now on full display, the once dominant Xus are forced to reckon with the rising power of a species they underestimated. In this clash of civilizations, the fate of the galaxy hangs in the balance, and the war between the Xus Empire and humanity is about to take a turn no one saw coming. Admiral VCSD stood on the bridge of his flagship, a Kalani-class destroyer, which was a symbol of the might of the Xus Empire. His role as the commanding officer of the Imperial Navy meant that his every decision was crucial to the success of the Empire. On this particular occasion, he had been summoned unexpectedly by one of his officers, a nervous-looking individual who had delivered the unsettling news that a human naval force was attempting to contact him. It was a strange request, one that filled the admiral with an immediate sense of unease. He had already dealt with the humans in skirmishes, but this was something different. The officer, jittery and apologetic, quickly informed him that the human force had hailed them through an open comm channel. VCSD's face tightened with irritation. He was a seasoned officer, far from the rookie recruits in the fleet, and he hated being interrupted during critical moments. But what really bothered him was the fact that this wasn't the first time the humans had made a nuisance of themselves. The war, which had started over control of valuable resources in a contested sector, had dragged on longer than anyone had anticipated. Despite the overwhelming technological advantage of the Xus, the humans were proving more resilient than expected. As the officer hesitated, unsure how to continue, the admiral's mind wandered to the reasons behind this unexpected resilience. The humans' tactics were unorthodox and seemed to defy the expectations of a technologically inferior species. Rather than face the might of the Empire head-on, they relied on hit-and-run strategies, guerrilla warfare, and stealth. These tactics had drawn admiration from certain corners of the Empire, though it also frustrated the admiral to no end. He had long been a proponent of traditional, direct confrontation, and these ambushes felt dishonorable. Yet, despite his disdain for their methods, the humans' persistence was undeniable. The admiral had spent years in military academies and had risen to the rank of prelate admiral, one of the most exalted positions in the Empire. He had served alongside many talented officers and had always been confident in the superiority of the U.S. military. It had always been clear to him that the Empire's forces were well-equipped and battle-tested. But as the war dragged on, the realization began to set in that the Empire's military had grown complacent. The humans, while seemingly primitive compared to the Xus, had been constantly adapting and learning, making them formidable opponents. Sighing deeply, Admiral VCSD turned to his first mate, a nervous young officer who had never quite gained the admiral's trust. The officer was apologetic, trying to explain that the human admiral had insisted on speaking with the highest-ranking officer. There was an underlying tone of fear in the officer's voice, something the admiral couldn't ignore. He gestured for the officer to continue. The mention of a human admiral trying to contact him on open communication channels was troubling, but it wasn't enough to unsettle the admiral just yet. What could they possibly want? Surely, they were not seeking to surrender after all this time. While his mind raced with possibilities, the admiral's frustration grew. He had hoped for a peaceful resolution, or perhaps another ambush that he could easily crush. But instead, the humans seemed to be making an open challenge. The officer confirmed that they were waiting patiently on hold, but the admiral was no longer certain this would be a simple exchange of words. The mere fact that they had insisted on speaking directly with him only added to the mystery. It was clear that the humans had no intention of negotiating, and that they were prepared to escalate the conflict. As the admiral continued to process the situation, he turned to his sensor officer, asking if they could detect the position of the human force. The officer's response did little to ease the admiral's anxiety. There were no visible ships, only a network of relays. The Admiral's suspicions were confirmed. The humans were likely not even in the system, using their usual tactics of deception and surprise. They never faced their enemies head-on, always lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike when least expected. The Xus Empire's strategy had been to wear the humans down over time, but the Admiral feared that might no longer be enough. Despite his frustration, the Admiral couldn't help but admire the humans' persistence. Their approach to warfare was unconventional, yet it was working. The War Council had dismissed his suggestions to adopt similar tactics, confident that the sheer might of the Empire would eventually overpower the humans. But the Admiral was no fool. He knew that if the humans were allowed to continue unchallenged, they would eventually find a way to turn the tide in their favor. And that possibility filled him with both dread and respect. But for now, the task at hand was to answer this strange communication. The war between the Xus Empire and humanity had begun over resource rights in a sector that was rich in valuable materials. At first, it seemed like a straightforward conflict. The Empire, with its advanced technology and vast fleet, assumed it would easily crush the humans who had only recently ventured into the stars. However, to their surprise, the humans were not as easily defeated as the Xus had anticipated. What was initially thought to be a brief skirmish for resources quickly escalated into a prolonged and unexpected conflict. From the very beginning, the humans' tactics were unconventional, to say the least. The Xus Empire had always prided itself on direct, overwhelming force. Their fleet was vast and equipped with the most advanced weaponry and technology, allowing them to crush most enemies with sheer power. The Admiral, in particular, had been trained in the ways of traditional warfare, where battles were decided by brute strength and military prowess. However, the humans had not engaged the Empire in the expected manner. Instead of facing them head-on in a battle for control, the humans had opted for guerrilla tactics. The Empire's military doctrine had long been one of overwhelming might and swift, decisive action. The idea of engaging in drawn-out, hit-and-run battles seemed beneath them. The Admiral, who had spent years rising through the ranks of the military, had been a staunch believer in the traditional methods of war. His belief was that the Xus military forces were superior to any other, and that no force, including the humans, could stand against them for long. However, it was becoming increasingly clear that the humans had other plans. While the Xus Empire relied on large-scale confrontations, the humans utilized smaller, more nimble ships, often using ambushes and sudden attacks to destabilize their opponents. The tactics seemed dishonorable in the eyes of the Admiral, who held a deep respect for direct confrontation. Yet, he could not deny that they were effective. The humans seemed to always be one step ahead, disappearing into the shadows before the Empire could retaliate. This constant back and forth had begun to wear on the Admiral, who found himself caught in a war of attrition. The humans, with their lesser technological advantages, were not engaging in the traditional ways of war. Instead, they had adopted a strategy of constant disruption. They struck when and where they were least expected, and disappeared before the Empire's forces could mount a proper counterattack. The Admiral began to understand that the war would not be won through brute force alone. It was a lesson that came slowly, but it was undeniable. Despite the Empire's advanced technology, the humans were proving to be formidable opponents in ways the Admiral had not foreseen. In meetings with his fellow commanders and military strategists, the Admiral had voiced his concerns about the human tactics. He had advocated for adopting similar methods, urging that the Empire's overwhelming force would not be enough on its own. The Empire's military had grown complacent, relying on their strength and numbers, while the humans adapted and fought with intelligence and cunning. But these suggestions had been dismissed by the War Council, who were confident that the Empire would eventually break the human resistance. Their arrogance was palpable, but the Admiral had learned not to trust overconfidence. Despite the War Council's dismissal, the Admiral knew that the humans were far from being easily defeated. Their tactics, though unorthodox, were proving effective. The battles had become increasingly difficult, with the humans constantly shifting their strategies and adapting to every move the Xus made. It was clear to the Admiral that the conflict would not end soon, and that the human resistance was not just a fleeting challenge. In fact, the humans might just have the resolve to win this war, something the Admiral had never considered. The Empire's complacency could very well lead to its downfall, and the Admiral knew that it was only a matter of time before the humans took full advantage of the Empire's weaknesses. Admiral VCSD had always been a staunch believer in the strength and superiority of the XUS military. Having spent years in military academies and climbing through the ranks, he had seen firsthand the power of the Empire's forces. The XUS military was vast, technologically advanced, and well-disciplined. The Admiral had always believed that victory was assured simply by the overwhelming might of their fleet. However, as the war with humanity dragged on, a creeping sense of doubt began to cloud his previously unwavering confidence. Despite his belief in the Empire's strength, the Admiral could not ignore the growing signs of complacency within his forces. Over time, the XUS military had grown accustomed to an easy superiority. For many years, they had faced little resistance from other species, and their victories had come swiftly and decisively. However, the prolonged conflict with the humans was exposing cracks in the Empire's military doctrine. The human forces, though technologically inferior, were proving resilient and resourceful, forcing the Admiral to reconsider the assumption that the Empire's strength would carry the day. The Admiral had noticed how the military's discipline had begun to falter. The once rigorous training, which had prepared soldiers for battle with unwavering resolve, now seemed to have lost its edge. The soldiers were becoming complacent, assuming that their advanced weaponry and powerful ships would win the war without requiring true effort or innovation. The Admiral, more than anyone, had seen this shift in attitude. While some officers in the Empire were eager for the honor of battle and glory, there were others who had become overly reliant on their technological superiority, believing it would always tip the scales in their favor. It frustrated the Admiral to no end that his warnings about complacency had fallen on deaf ears. He had even proposed changes to the military strategies, advocating for more dynamic approaches to combat, similar to the tactics used by the humans. But his suggestions had been swiftly dismissed by the War Council, which was made up of senior officers who, despite their experience, lacked the adaptability needed for the modern conflict. They believed that the humans were merely a temporary nuisance, easily defeated by the Empire's overwhelming power. The Admiral, however, had grown increasingly concerned that this overconfidence was the Empire's greatest weakness. This complacency within the military had made the Admiral's job even more difficult. He could no longer rely solely on the same strategies that had brought the Empire success in the past. The humans had shown themselves to be unpredictable, refusing to fight on the Empire's terms. They had adapted quickly, and every time the Admiral thought he understood their tactics, they shifted once again. The traditional methods of war that the Empire had relied upon for centuries were no longer effective, and this left the Admiral feeling as though he were fighting with one hand tied behind his back. As the war continued, the Admiral found himself increasingly frustrated with the Empire's inability to adapt. He had fought in countless battles, but none had felt as challenging as this one. The humans, though outmatched in terms of technology, had proven that resourcefulness and determination could offset even the most powerful forces. The Admiral had always prided himself on his tactical acumen, but against the humans, his usual strategies seemed to fall short. The longer the conflict continued, the more it became clear that simply relying on their superiority would not be enough to secure a victory. In the quiet moments, when the Admiral was alone with his thoughts, he would often reflect on the war's progression and the stubbornness of his superiors. The human tactics had forced him to question the very foundations of the Empire's military doctrine. What was the point of having the most powerful fleet in the galaxy if it couldn't adapt to the changing dynamics of warfare? He had always believed that the Empire's might would crush any opposition, but the humans had proved him wrong time and again. The Admiral could not shake the feeling that the war had become a battle not just between two armies, but between two fundamentally different approaches to conflict, one of power and tradition, the other of cunning and adaptability. The realization was both sobering and humbling. The communication from the human Admiral was unexpected, yet it carried an air of audacity that the Admiral could not ignore. After enduring numerous skirmishes and exchanges with human forces, Admiral VCSD had long since ceased to consider them a significant threat. However, this new development was different. The human admiral had specifically requested to speak to the highest-ranking officer of the XUS military. This alone was enough to spark the admiral's curiosity. Normally, the humans would communicate through lower-level officers or send an emissary for negotiations. But now, they wanted to address him directly, which could mean anything. Perhaps they were trying to negotiate a surrender, or perhaps it was another scheme to provoke his forces into a mistake. As the message came through, the admiral's first reaction was one of mild skepticism. He had never respected the humans' ability to fight in a traditional sense. Their tactics, while effective in small-scale engagements, were far from honorable in the eyes of the XUS military. Yet, the fact that a human admiral sought to speak with him directly suggested that something new was at play. The admiral's mind was already running through the possibilities. The humans might be preparing for another attack, or perhaps they were seeking some form of truce. Either way, the admiral was not prepared to make concessions. The Empire's military strength was unmatched, and he was confident that a human admiral would not pose a serious threat. When the human appeared on the holographic display, the admiral was struck by the appearance of the creature. To his trained eyes, the human seemed almost grotesque. Their physical features lacked the symmetrical beauty of the XUS, and their awkward posture only added to the sense of discomfort. The human race, in the admiral's eyes, seemed a far cry from the advanced and glorious species that the XUS Empire prided itself on being. Yet, the admiral was careful not to let these thoughts show on his face. As an academy graduate, he had learned to separate personal feelings from military matters. Despite the human's unsightly appearance, the admiral remained focused on the conversation at hand. The human admiral's first words were casual, even flippant, which only served to irritate Admiral VCSD further. It was not uncommon for humans to display a certain level of bravado, but the nonchalance of this individual seemed almost disrespectful. The humans seemed to have no understanding of the honor that the XUS Empire attached to their military ranks. The human's casual remark about confirming the admiral's identity struck a nerve. It was almost as if they were mocking the importance of his position. The admiral's pride was wounded, but he kept his composure. He responded coolly, confirming his title and rank, reminding the human that he was one of the few exalted amongst his race. The human's response, however, did nothing to ease the admiral's frustration. Rather than discuss terms of surrender or present a formal message, the human laughed and spoke about new toys they wanted to show off. It was a bizarre comment that the admiral didn't quite understand. The human continued, stating that they weren't interested in surrendering, but rather in engaging in battle. This admission threw the admiral off guard. The humans, with their inferior technology, wanted to fight? It was an audacious challenge. The admiral's military pride took over, and he decided that he would not back down. He could not afford to let the humans think they could provoke him with such a challenge. The human's strange gestures during the conversation, such as raising its appendages and shrugging, added to the perplexing nature of the exchange. The admiral had studied human behavior and knew that these gestures were meant to convey uncertainty or indifference. The human seemed almost too casual about the idea of battle. It was as though it had no concept of the seriousness of the situation, as though the thought of war didn't hold the same weight for them as it did for the admiral. The admiral, still taken aback, tried to regain control of the situation. He wanted to ensure that this would be a battle of honor, one where the humans would not flee as they had in previous skirmishes. He demanded that they engage in a proper fight, not their usual hit-and-run tactics. The humans' response was not what the admiral expected. Rather than agree immediately, the human made a cryptic comment about not being able to run once they used their new toys. The admiral's curiosity was piqued, but he refused to show any weakness. He took the human's comment as a subtle threat, but he did not back down. He declared that they would engage in battle on his terms, demanding that the humans fight honorably. He was determined to win, to prove that the might of the Empire was unshakable, no matter what new weapons the humans might have. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that this encounter was not as straightforward as it seemed. As the conversation ended abruptly, and the human communication was cut off, the Admiral was left with a sense of unease. The human's words and casual demeanor made him wonder what he had just agreed to. He quickly ordered the fleet to prepare for battle, calling for a state of high alert. Something about this exchange felt different, and he couldn't shake the suspicion that the humans had something up their sleeve. As the fleet scrambled to prepare for the engagement, the Admiral found himself questioning the true purpose of the humans' contact. Was this a trick? A diversion? Or were the humans truly ready to face him in battle? The Admiral's instincts told him that something was wrong as he stood on the bridge of his flagship, preparing for the upcoming battle with the humans. His long years of experience had taught him to trust his gut, and right now, everything about the human Admiral's message felt off. The cryptic comments about the humans' new toys stirred a sense of unease in him. Despite his outward confidence and his firm belief in the superiority of the XUS military, he couldn't shake the feeling that the humans had something unexpected in store. His mind raced through possible strategies and tactics the humans might be planning, but nothing seemed to make sense given what he knew about their capabilities. The Admiral's fleet had been on high alert since the end of the conversation, and he could feel the tension on the bridge as his crew scrambled to prepare. He had spent countless hours overseeing every aspect of the fleet's readiness, ensuring that his ships were primed for any eventuality. However, even as the final preparations were underway, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. The humans had shown an ability to adapt, and they were not playing by the same rules the XUS Empire had always followed. This unpredictability made them far more dangerous than he had originally believed. He knew that his fleet's traditional strength might not be enough to counter whatever the humans were planning. The sensors officer on the bridge reported that there were gravitational anomalies appearing on their scanners. This was significant. The human FTL, faster than light, drives were notoriously inefficient, and it was well known that the process of dropping back into normal space created detectable gravitational disturbances. The Admiral had studied the human FTL technology in great detail, knowing that it was slow and required significant recharge time. It was this weakness, he believed, that had allowed the Empire to track and destroy human vessels with relative ease. But now, these anomalies were growing stronger, suggesting the humans were using their FTL in ways the Admiral had not anticipated. As the gravitational anomalies grew more intense, the Admiral's concerns deepened. His fleet sensors were picking up an unusually high number of disturbances, signaling that the humans were preparing to enter the system in full force. The Admiral quickly ordered his fleet to prepare their defenses. There was no telling what the humans were planning, but one thing was clear. They were not going to follow the traditional rules of engagement. The Admiral's earlier demand for a fair battle, where the humans would face his fleet head-on, seemed naive now. The humans had something up their sleeves, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. Suddenly, the sensor officer reported a disturbing development. The human ships, which had previously been scattered throughout the sector, were now appearing directly above the Admiral's fleet. The gravity anomalies had become too strong to ignore, and the Admiral's worst fears were confirmed. The humans were using their FTL technology in a way that allowed them to drop directly into the heart of the battle, above his fleet, in a position of overwhelming advantage. This was a tactic that the XUS Empire had never seen before. The Admiral realized that the humans had weaponized their FTL drives in a way that made them not just unpredictable, but lethal. The human ships were now positioned above the Admiral's fleet, and the sight was truly horrifying. The ships, appearing out of nowhere, seemed to be surrounded by small black holes, micro-black holes, generated by the collapse of mass during their FTL transition. The micro-black holes were a result of the human ships' manipulation of their FTL technology, creating gravitational distortions so powerful that they could tear apart anything in their immediate vicinity. The Admiral had heard of such a phenomenon in theoretical studies, but to witness it in action was another matter entirely. His escort ships, which had been tasked with defending his flagship, were already being shredded by the intense gravitational forces. Panic set in on the bridge as the Admiral realized the gravity of the situation. His fleet was being torn apart by an enemy that had not only bypassed his defenses, but had done so with devastating efficiency. Worse still, The human ships seemed to be oriented upside down relative to his own fleet, with their weapons aimed directly at his ship. His fleet's point defense cannons, designed to intercept incoming fire, were completely ineffective in this situation. The admiral's own ship was completely exposed, unable to respond to the threat in time. The realization that his fleet was no longer in control of the battle came crashing down on him. The humans had outmaneuvered them in a way he could never have predicted. As the human ships closed in, the admiral's worst fears were realized. The sheer destructive power of their weapons, combined with the unpredictable effects of their FTL technology, meant that the battle was already lost. His flagship was now under direct assault, and there was nothing he or his crew could do to stop it. The admiral, who had spent his entire career commanding fleets and winning battles, could only watch in helpless disbelief as his forces were torn apart. The battle, if it could even be called that, was not a fair fight. It was a one-sided slaughter. The humans had won, not through superior firepower or sheer numbers, but by using their technology in ways the admiral could never have imagined. In the chaos of the assault, the admiral's final words, questioning whether they would stand a chance against the humans, were lost amid the wreckage of his fleet. The turning point in the war had come not through a battle of strength, but through the ingenuity and unpredictability of humanity. The admiral's realization that his fleet had been caught off guard by the humans' unconventional tactics brought a heavy weight to his chest. For years, the Xus Empire had prided itself on its technological superiority, its military dominance, and its disciplined tactics. Yet in an instant, all of that had been proven insufficient. The human admiral, with his cryptic message and casual demeanor, had lured the admiral into a trap. What the Xus had considered a simple war of resources had now escalated into a battle of survival, one where they were completely outmatched by an enemy that was not only unpredictable, but technologically advanced in ways they had not foreseen. As the battle unfolded and the micro-black holes continued to tear through his fleet, the admiral's mind raced with thoughts of how the humans had managed to weaponize their FTL technology. He had studied it in depth, knowing it was inefficient and slow. It was supposed to be a glaring weakness that the Empire could exploit. However, what the humans had done was nothing short of revolutionary. They had found a way to turn that weakness into a strength, using the very forces of gravity and mass generated by their FTL drives to create devastating effects on his fleet. The admiral couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and frustration. This was not a victory that came through brute force, but through ingenuity and an unconventional use of existing technology. The realization that the humans had somehow managed to manipulate their FTL technology to generate black holes and disrupt the very fabric of space itself left the admiral feeling helpless. His fleet, which had been the pride of the Xus Empire, was now nothing more than a sitting target. As the micro-black holes continued to destabilize the ships, his escort vessels were shredded by the intense gravitational forces. The admiral knew that his forces were no match for the sheer destructive potential of the humans' new weaponized FTL drives. The Empire's traditional methods, honed over centuries, were suddenly obsolete in the face of such a radical innovation. There was no way to counteract the effects of the micro-black holes or the gravitational anomalies they created. What struck the admiral the most was how quickly the humans had adapted. They had faced countless defeats in the war against the Empire, but instead of succumbing to their inferiority, they had taken those losses and learned from them. The humans had transformed their greatest weakness into a lethal advantage, and the admiral was left wondering how they had managed to achieve such a technological breakthrough. In many ways, it was a testament to human resilience. They had fought and struggled, yet in their desperation, they had created a weapon that had turned the tide of the war. It was a reminder that the Xus Empire, for all its might, was not invincible. As the admiral watched the destruction unfold around him, he found himself questioning the Empire's entire approach to the war. For too long, they had relied on their sheer strength and numbers, believing that this alone would win them the conflict. They had dismissed the humans as a minor nuisance, not worthy of serious consideration. But now, the admiral saw the truth. The humans were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting to win, and they were willing to innovate and adapt to achieve that goal. The admiral, for the first time in his career, found himself on the back foot, struggling to comprehend how the war had shifted so drastically in favor of the humans. It became increasingly clear to the admiral that the humans had learned from every engagement, refining their tactics and technology with each defeat. The black hole, weaponized FTL, was a perfect example of this. The XUS had never encountered such a tactic, and as the admiral watched the destruction unfold, he realized that this was no accident. The humans had carefully calculated their strategy, knowing that their greatest strength lay not in their ships or weapons, but in their ability to adapt and overcome. The admiral was struck by the sheer audacity of their approach. They had turned the very thing that had been their greatest disadvantage, the inefficiency of their FTL technology, into a weapon of mass destruction. The admiral's final moments were filled with a sense of grim acceptance. There was no longer any chance of winning this battle, let alone the war. His flagship, the pride of the XUS Empire, was being torn apart by the relentless force of the humans' black holes, and his fleet was in disarray. The damage was irreparable, and the admiral knew that the battle would be over soon. As his ship continued to buckle under the strain of the gravitational forces, he couldn't help but wonder if the war would ever be the same again. The humans, through sheer innovation and resilience, had proven that they were not the weaklings the Empire had assumed them to be. In the end, it was not just the weaponry or the battles that would define the war, but the humans' ability to learn, adapt, and fight with every tool at their disposal. The turning point had arrived, and the admiral could do little but watch as the Empire's dominance crumbled before him. The battle between the admiral's fleet and the humans, which had once seemed like a simple clash over resources, quickly transformed into a devastating loss for the XUS Empire. The human ships had turned the tide with an unexpected and extraordinary weapon, the weaponized use of their FTL technology. The admiral, despite his years of training and experience, had never imagined that the humans would be capable of such an innovation. The shift in the balance of power was palpable, and the XUS fleet, once a symbol of military might, was now helpless in the face of this new threat. The admiral's once confident demeanor now gave way to disbelief as his ships were torn apart by the micro-black holes generated by the humans' FTL technology. The admiral's flagship, the heart of his fleet, had been rendered helpless in mere moments. The intense gravitational forces caused by the micro-black holes began tearing through the hull of his ship, overwhelming its defenses. It was a sight the admiral had never imagined possible. His mighty vessel, the pride of the XUS Empire, being reduced to scrap before his eyes. The black holes were like invisible predators, ripping apart the very fabric of space and crushing everything in their path. As his ship began to collapse under the strain, the admiral knew there was nothing that could be done. The battle was lost, and with it, any hope of victory for his fleet. The sight of his fleet in ruins brought the admiral a grim realization. The XUS Empire's military superiority had been shattered in an instant. He had underestimated the resourcefulness of the humans, thinking them to be no more than primitive creatures who lacked the ingenuity to mount a serious challenge. But the humans had proved him wrong in the most brutal way possible. Their ability to think outside the box, to turn their weaknesses into strengths, had upended the entire conflict. The admiral, who had once looked down on the humans, now found himself at their mercy, watching as his fleet was obliterated by a technology he couldn't even begin to understand. As the admiral's flagship descended into chaos, he could hear the screams of his crew, the cries of those who had been loyal to the XUS Empire for years. The once orderly bridge was now a scene of panic, as officers scrambled to carry out orders that no longer mattered. The admiral's mind was consumed by a mix of disbelief and regret. How had they failed so spectacularly? The humans, with their inferior technology and seemingly primitive weapons, had turned the tide of the war with a single, brilliant tactical breakthrough. The admiral couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal by his own arrogance. They had assumed their strength would be enough to crush the humans, but instead, it was the humans' ingenuity that had outclassed them. The black holes continued to wreak havoc on the fleet as the admiral struggled to retain control over his thoughts. He had dedicated his life to the study of warfare, honing his skills as a strategist and a leader, yet he had been blindsided by the most unexpected of tactics. The micro-black holes were not just a weapon, they were a statement of human defiance. The humans had come to the battlefield not just to survive, but to win, and they had done so by exploiting every advantage they could, including the very weaknesses that the Xus Empire had once used to dismiss them. The Admiral's mind raced as he tried to process the full extent of what had just happened. Despite the chaos, the Admiral's thoughts turned toward the future of the war. He knew that this battle would mark a turning point, not just for his fleet, but for the entire conflict. The humans had demonstrated that they were capable of more than the Empire had ever imagined. The sheer audacity of their strategy was something the Xus Empire would need to reckon with if they hoped to regain control of the war. But the Admiral also understood that the damage had been done. The humans had shown that they were not just a force to be reckoned with. They were a force that could outthink, outmaneuver, and outfight the Empire at every turn. The war had just become far more dangerous for the Xus. As the Admiral's flagship continued to break apart under the relentless assault of the human ships, he found himself reflecting on the failure of the Xus Empire's arrogance. The humans, who had once seemed like an insignificant threat, had now become the Empire's greatest adversary. In the face of overwhelming odds, they had proven themselves to be worthy opponents, not by fighting with the same methods as the Xus, but by adapting and creating something entirely new. The turning point had come, and with it, the realization that the Xus Empire could no longer rely on its traditional strengths. The humans had shown that innovation, not brute force, would determine the outcome of this war. The Admiral's final thoughts, as the destruction of his flagship became inevitable, were consumed by the recognition that the Xus Empire had been outsmarted, and their reign of dominance was now in jeopardy. The aftermath of the battle marked a significant turning point in the war between the Xus Empire and humanity. What was once a confident empire, believing in its technological superiority and unmatched military might, now stood on the brink of defeat. The human ships, though fewer in number, had managed to decimate the Xus fleet with a single, ingenious weapon, a weapon that the Empire had never even considered. The humans' ability to adapt and innovate on the fly had turned the tide, shifting the power balance in the war. The Admiral's flagship, once a symbol of the Empire's might, was reduced to wreckage, and with it, the heart of the Xus military had been shattered. The defeat would not be easily forgotten. The destruction of the fleet was not just a loss of ships and soldiers. It was a blow to the very foundation of the Xus Empire. For centuries, the Empire had maintained an air of invincibility, built on the backs of technological advancements, overwhelming numbers, and sheer military might. The thought that a relatively small and seemingly primitive species could turn the tide of the war so decisively was a humiliating realization for the Xus leadership. It was clear that humanity, far from being a minor nuisance, was now a formidable opponent capable of challenging the Empire's dominance. The Empire's military leaders would have to come to terms with this harsh truth. The war could no longer be won through brute force alone. In the days following the battle, the surviving members of the Xus leadership convened to reassess their strategy. The Admiral's defeat had left a void in the leadership, but it also sparked a wider conversation about the direction of the war. There were those within the Empire who insisted on continuing the fight, driven by the desire to preserve their honor and power. However, there were others who saw the writing on the wall and understood that the war, as it had been fought, was no longer winnable. The humans had proven their adaptability and their capacity for technological innovation, and their relentless pursuit of victory meant that the Empire could no longer rely on the tactics that had served them for so long. The failure of the Xus military to anticipate humanity's advances also led to a deeper examination of their own technological limitations. The Admiral's final thoughts before the battle had been consumed by the realization that the Empire's reliance on outdated tactics and technology had left them vulnerable. The humans had found a way to exploit the weaknesses of the Empire's FTL technology, turning what should have been an advantage into a weapon. The Empire had always prided itself on its technological prowess, but in the face of human ingenuity, even the most advanced systems seemed inadequate. The question now was whether the Xus could evolve quickly enough to counter the new threat, or if their complacency would lead to their ultimate downfall. Meanwhile, humanity, emboldened by their unexpected victory, began to plan for the next phase of the war. The human admiral, whose casual demeanor had disguised his brilliant tactical mind, became a symbol of their newfound confidence. The success of the battle was not just due to their superior technology, but their willingness to think differently, to approach problems from unexpected angles. The human victory had been a triumph of innovation, and it galvanized the human forces to push forward with renewed determination. They knew they had the upper hand now, but they also understood that this was only the beginning. The war would not be over until the Xus Empire had been brought to its knees, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to ensure that outcome. The human success had an unintended consequence on their relationship with the other factions in the galaxy. Many races, who had once viewed humanity as weak and insignificant, now began to reconsider their own positions. The defeat of the Xus fleet had proven that even the mightiest empires were vulnerable. Smaller factions and independent groups began to align themselves with humanity, seeing in them a potential ally capable of standing up to the greater powers. This shift in allegiance threatened to unravel the balance of power in the galaxy, and the Xus Empire, already reeling from its military loss, found itself facing new political challenges as well. The war was no longer just a conflict between two factions. It had become a struggle for the future of the entire galaxy. As the war raged on, the human victory at the turning point would come to symbolize the Empire's decline and humanity's rise. The battle marked the beginning of a new era, one where innovation, adaptability, and the willingness to challenge the status quo would define the outcome of conflicts. The Xus Empire, now forced to reckon with the consequences of its complacency and underestimation of humanity, found itself in a battle for survival on multiple fronts. It was no longer just a matter of winning the war. It was a matter of whether the Empire could adapt to the new reality or if humanity's brilliance would lead to their downfall. The future of the galaxy was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The war had changed forever.